it's important for us to understand how we've been conditioned and shaped and how that affects how we move through the world. The tools, systems used are the same against folks who are less proximal to social and institutional power. And because these systems are doing this to us all, right, those of us less proximal to power, I think it's important to understand the larger patterns at play so we can engage our practice to disrupt the patterns. Why it's important to have a spiritual grounding as an activist, as a human, I would say, but as an activist particularly.
What is up, my witches? Welcome to the Queer Soul Alchemy podcast, a supportive community helping queer folks to embrace their authentic selves by exploring yoga, astrology, and spirituality. I'm your host, Lee Davey. Welcome back, everybody. I'm your host and favorite queer NB priestess, Lee Davey, a 500-hour certified yoga instructor, 600-hour certified Ayurvedic health counselor, and a 100% certifiable self-development nerd. And in this episode, I am very excited to be sharing a conversation with you about yoga, social justice, and racial equity with a special guest, author Cassandra Johnson. We'll acknowledge the general lack of diversity among yoga practitioners and studios in Western yoga, briefly touch on the root causes of that, and discuss how to radicalize your yoga practice both on and off the mat to create a more just world. But first, new episodes of this podcast drop every Wednesday, posted on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. In order for this podcast to continue, this is the part of the show where I am obliged to beg of you to please make an offering to the algorithm gods by leaving the show a like, a comment, and a 5-star review. And please, won't you subscribe? Won't somebody think of the queers so that we can continue to help your fellow queer spiritual seekers find this magic? Don't miss out on exclusive access to my free self-care resource guide, which I've specifically curated for you to support your journey with spirituality. To download this guide and be the first to know about upcoming queer yoga retreats and events, please sign up for our email newsletter at www.youareloved.one/pod. All right, you guys, let's dive into today's discussion on how to radicalize your yoga practice to create a more just world with guest author Cassandra Johnson. I read her book, Skill in Action, earlier this year when I was in Guatemala, and I've been super inspired by it, especially given the state of our country and the state of the world. So much so that I posted about the book on Instagram and I tagged her for credit, and she reached out and offered to send me an updated edition, which is longer. So this is the short version that I have already read. It is, oh wow, this one's under 100 pages long. And then this is the updated edition that she sent me. So I'm very excited to read this one, which is over 200 pages long. So lots more good details. So generous of her to offer to send me this free of charge. So I really appreciated that. So guys, I want to preface this with a bit of context about the yoga industry in general, because if you're not part of the industry, if you don't work in it, some of this might come as a surprise. I mean, it did for me as I became part of this industry. I got into yoga because I believe deeply in creating ethical, socially conscious content and spaces that acknowledge the ongoing impacts of capitalism, colonialism, and white supremacy around the world. And my commitment to anti-racist work and allyship comes from a genuine desire to help create more equitable, inclusive systems within those spiritual and wellness spaces, and really every space that I occupy, right? So one of the questions that has continuously popped up and stayed with me throughout my yoga journey is, yoga was created by brown people. So why are so many modern yoga spaces overwhelmingly white? And the short answer is capitalism, because both white supremacy and colonialism are perpetuated and incentivized by capitalism. And all three systems of power are so deeply woven into the fabric of global culture and industry that, of course, they're going to permeate yoga too. Right? Those systems permeate everything. Like, these systems of power run in the background of literally every aspect of our lives. Since committing to the yogic path in 2017, I've noticed that the persistent whitewashing of yoga and the wellness culture across studios, Online media and retreat spaces happens both in the US and internationally. So yes, even in India, where yoga was founded. And while I cannot speak for people of color, conversations with community members have highlighted two major barriers to inclusion, which are accessibility and representation. So financial accessibility affects a lot of different populations. I'm not dismissing anyone's experience, but it does disproportionately affect people of color. Yoga classes, yoga props, yoga teacher trainings for sure, and even special clothes marketed as like yoga pants and yoga leggings are often a luxury level expensive. Systemic oppression impacts people of color economically, and not having even available free time to take a class or access to reliable transportation or childcare can pose major barriers. Many yoga studios and wellness spaces are also located in affluent, predominantly white neighborhoods. And then the second major barrier is representation. In my conversations with people of color, they have shared with me that yoga simply has not felt like a space created for them because they rarely saw teachers or even students in the space who reflected their own identities and lived experiences. When people see themselves reflected by a community, when they see people that look like them being part of that community, then they're naturally going to feel more safe and welcomed and empowered to participate, right? In my observation, classes led by instructors of color just naturally attract more racially diverse students, which makes sense, right? So this demonstrates that the issue is not a lack of interest in yoga, but rather a lack of accessibility, visibility, and inclusion within the dominant wellness culture. I believe that the true practice of yoga involves actively uplifting and centering diverse voices, leadership, and experiences while engaging in these conversations with humility, accountability, and a willingness to learn. The yogic practice of ahimsa or nonviolence invites us not only to minimize our own harmful impact in the world, but also to actively fight against harm and violence that is being done in the world by others. So, no matter where you are, or who you are, or where you come from, you are welcome here. You are loved here, and you are enough here in the Queer Soul Alchemy community. The resources available on this podcast will remain free, and the practices from yoga and Ayurveda that we share here can help us to reclaim our bodies and heal within community and with the earth. Let's move into this yoga and social justice conversation. Michelle Cassandra Johnson is an author, activist, spiritual teacher, racial equity consultant and educator, and intuitive and shamanic healer. She approaches her life and work from a place of knowing we are, can, and must heal individually and collectively. Michelle facilitates workshops and immersions, leads retreats and transformative experiences nationwide, and offers an array of healing services for individuals and groups. For over 25 years as a racial equity educator, she has worked with large corporations, nonprofits, and community groups. Michelle is a 6-time published author, a TEDx speaker, and has been interviewed on several podcasts in which she explores embodied approaches to racial equity work, creating ritual injustice spaces, our divine connection with nature and spirit, and how we as a culture can heal. Welcome, Michelle. Welcome to the Queer Soul Alchemy podcast. So great to have you.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me to be a guest.
Michelle and I connected on Instagram after I read her book, Skill in Action, and she was kind enough to send me a copy of a later version of her book, which I was so excited to receive in the mail just a few days ago. The original version that I had read was shorter. I'm not sure how many iterations there has been since then, but the book is all about radicalizing our yoga practice to create a just world, using our yoga practice off the mat for creating social justice in the world. However, you would like to introduce your work and yourself, Michelle, please.
My name's Michelle. My pronouns are she and her, and I am on the ancestral land right now of the Catawba, Cherokee, Tutelo, Saponi, Occaneechi, and many other tribes in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. The first edition of Skill in Action came out in 2017, and the edition you have, the second edition, came out fall of 2021. It is much longer. It's over 100 pages longer than the first edition, with a lot more practices and just expanded content and inquiry, really, around what it actually means to radicalize our practice of yoga, particularly when there is so much unrest and disruption socially and culturally and politically, not just in the US where I am, but all over the globe. We know there's a lot happening. And I have been a yoga teacher since 2009, a yoga practitioner for much longer than that. And Skill in Action was my first book. So since then, I've written several other books. And it was really emerged from having attended many yoga classes and a teacher training, and my background as an anti-racism, racial equity educator, but also living in a Black body in America. For decades. And Skill in Action came from this place of being an organizer and making change in my community, and this contemplation of how do we engage spiritual practice and a spiritual path to support us, to inspire us, to activate us as we make change, and to activate us to make change, I would say, in community. Because when I was exposed to yoga as a spiritual path and lineage, what started to happen is I began to experience the path as sort of the outline of how we actually create justice, the different limbs of the path. And I studied the 8-limb path. There are different paths. For example, the yamas and niyamas, these moral observances towards self and others, felt like this outline. If we actually align with them, what would our world be like? And that happened with every part of the path and all of the teachings. I just kept having questions about, well, how do we apply this to the now and where we are? And isn't that the point of this, right? It's not just for me to practice asanas or physical movement. That's part of it. But I just knew there was something else pairing my anti-oppression and racial equity and just sort of human experience with this path of yoga and what I was learning. So that's where Skill in Action came from. Initially, I knew I wanted to share some about my experience in the world through yoga and through my activist work. And I knew there was an intersection of activism and yoga and wanted to bring voice to that. And then the second edition came from an invitation by Shambhala Publications to write it, but also years of then experience training folks across the country and even outside of the country, different parts of the globe, about skill in action, about the principles of yoga, the path of yoga, about activism and why it's important to have a spiritual grounding as an activist, as a human, I would say, but as an activist, particularly change agent, community member. And the second edition emerged from having met with other people who, one, had the same questions I did about how do we actually practice? What does it mean to live our practice? And learning alongside folks who were on the front lines and really committed to spiritual practice and spiritual grounding. So, I could probably write another edition now from like them. I've met thousands of people now, trained thousands of people, been in spaces with many people in conversation about skill and action. The other thing I'll name here is that Skill and Action, the title is from the Bhagavad Gita, which is a text that I work with a lot, teach from a lot. People may be familiar with it. And there is a verse in it, yoga is skill in action. And so there's a story in the book, Skill in Action, about when I first heard that, having not at that time yet, I wasn't exposed to the Bhagavad Gita. That was like my first introduction to it, hearing that verse, and it really activated me. And so when I thought about a title for this, Skill in Action so very much aligned with my desire to apply the teachings to a way of living in the world. So that's where I'll begin, other than to say I do a lot of things in addition to like write and teach and train on a lot of different topics, all of which have to do with healing and spiritual practice in some way to support us. So my work has expanded since Skill in Action launched in many, many different ways. And it feels like, one of the roots, right? Or this beginning point for me connected to all that I do now.
Beautiful. And you explain so beautifully in the book how you have been doing this anti-racism work for a very long time, and then your own personal experience of coming to yoga, and you focus so much on the breath and the just sensation of the breath and your experience of the breath in this culture. And I would just love for you to share a little bit about your experience coming to the path of yoga from that world of activism.
Yeah, I appreciate this question. Yesterday, I offer spiritual guidance, spiritual direction, spiritual companionship. It's called different things. And I met with someone yesterday and I led a meditation where we focused on the breath and also a connection to the below and the above, earth and sky. And we had this conversation after the practice that I led about an opening they experienced related to earth and sky through the breath. And so, like, some doorway open, some portal, some connection to their body and an energy center in a way they hadn't experienced before. And it took me back to this teaching about the breath and life and the connection between the two. And often, what I have said, and it's in Skill and Action in many ways, that breath is life giving, it's generative. And most of my activist work and also in relationship to other activist organizers, folks I work with and alongside, part of what we respond to is the way systems and policies and the cultural context and dominance and supremacy, how all of these forces created by people and enacted by people, how these things take the breath away. And a lot of what we work toward is to afford folks access to life, which is breath, in all of the ways, right? Freedom of expression, freedom of movement, agency, sovereignty. And so that's how I think about the breath and cycles of breath. And yes, the mechanics and anatomy related to breath, inhaling and exhaling, but it's always been much deeper for me. When I was born, I couldn't breathe. My mother looks at me all the time. I mean, and I think she looks at me and she talks about my being a miracle in this way because of her experience of almost losing me, right? Because I didn't have access to breath. And it's interesting, when I wrote the first edition of Skill in Action, I didn't really know, and there's more of it in the second edition, the story of my birth and all of the details. And at one point I asked her about that. And that became part of the first edition of Skill in Action, like where I'm from and my origin story, and how interesting from that place of not having access to breath as I'm trying to come into life, right? Then I became a yoga teacher where I tell people to breathe all the time. I'm fascinated. This is an aside, by birth stories and the trajectory then that is, or even the karma, like the path. I mean, there are a lot of different ways I could describe it. I'm obsessed with that in this way, like curious about it, and how, for me, the way I came in just unknowingly at the time, I imagined defined in so many ways the way that I relate to the breath and spiritual practice and activism and trying to afford people that space to breathe, because I understand we need breath to live, and how breath is liberation. I don't mean we just, we physically need to be able to breathe, right? And not be in polluted conditions which affect our breath. For example, we need conditions in place that nourish us and allow us to be able to breathe on all different levels, right? Every way one might think of that. So I know there's a line in Skill and Action about the breath being taken away and how oppression takes the breath away, and how yoga offers a way of living that leads us toward liberation and deeper breaths. And that this, like, urging for us to find a new way to live using the brilliant ancient technology that is yoga.
Well, so many layers to the breath, like our collective breath as humans and each person's individual breath, and then like nature, like Mother Nature's breath herself. That really stood out to me and struck me because it is something that we relatively take for granted, right?
Mhm.
But it is also something that can mean the difference between life and death quicker than anything else. Water, food, we can go without for a little while, but the breath we can only go without for maybe a few minutes. And it also really struck a chord with me. You said the second edition of the book came out in 2021, so shortly after George Floyd
Mhm.
murder. And of course, the I can't breathe. And during the pandemic, everybody with the masks, I can't breathe. It is really such a powerful sentiment. And the analogy of not being able to breathe under the weight of oppression also I felt was very apt.
Hmm.
And was it asthma or another health condition for you?
Yeah, I've had asthma. I was diagnosed at age 4. Both my parents, my father's deceased, but both my parents, my dad had terrible asthma. My mom was diagnosed much later in life. And the reason I couldn't breathe when I came in was I was premature. So I was born 2 months early, which is quite early. I was born in 1975. There wasn't a preemie unit where I was. I mean, spaces now, some spaces in different parts of the world are definitely designed differently than when I came in. I had to be transported to a different hospital because they didn't have what they needed where I was to help me. My mother likely experienced some medical issues that actually made it difficult for me to breathe or have access. So like actual access to air was cut off, and they ended up doing an emergency C-section, so to get me out so that I could breathe. But even so, I was tiny. I was like 2 pounds and 3 ounces and had underdeveloped lungs and the genetics already set up to have asthma. So I think there was just a lot of, as you said, layers connected to life and breath. Also, I think my desire, often I say, I think I chose to be here now. I didn't choose all of the mess. I don't really know that I chose, like, I don't know that we consented to this, like all the stuff that's happening. I don't, and I can be more specific, but I don't know if I chose that. But I do think I chose to be in this incarnation with this dharma related to making space for people to breathe. That's what I think I chose, even as my breath was compromised, right, in these ways. And I've had asthma my whole life. It's not, I use an inhaler every day to manage it. Even as a yogi, right, there are all these pranayama practices we can practice. I've practiced so many of them, which they help. But whenever I don't have my inhaler, this daily maintenance inhaler, I notice my breath is compromised. And so it's not just a memory. It's like an experience every day of knowing that I need something to help me breathe more freely. And I think the imprint of that and experience of that deepens my commitment to make space in all the ways for others to breathe and be free.
I believe you touch on this in the book as well, just the fact of breathing deeply requires taking up more space. And there's a certain amount of vulnerability or cojones, we might say, to take up that space. And I think that a lot of people that listen to this episode will resonate with having asthma or having allergies or autoimmune of some,
Yes.
because a lot of our listeners are in Ohio. I'm based in Ohio, and apparently
Mm,
Ohio is like one of the worst states to live in for allergies and asthma. And there's also a lot of overlap with queerness and being chronically ill or having like autoimmune. And we also know that people of color are disproportionately affected by all of these chronic illnesses. So yeah, there's a lot of deep layers we could go into with like generational trauma around all of that. But this is why I'm so passionate about bringing yoga to these underserved communities.
I'm glad you shared that because I think it's important for us in this. There's an activity in Skill and Action in the first edition, uniquely positioned, and in the second one, that's there too. But social location, it's important for us to understand our social group memberships and identity and how we've been conditioned and shaped and how that affects how we move through the world. And it's also important to understand where there's overlap because the tools systems used are the same against folks who are less proximal to social and institutional power. And so I just think it's important to uplift, like, I'm in a Black body and grew up in Virginia and have had asthma my whole life. And you named in the communities in which you teach, like a lot of queer folks do have autoimmune diseases and asthma, and that there's some resonance. And because these systems are doing this to us all, right, those of us less proximal to power, I think it's important when we can to make those connections to understand the larger patterns at play so we can engage our practice to disrupt the patterns and also to recognize the similarities in our experiences, even if we have different social locations. Like supremacy is happening in all these different ways. And I name this because of just having done anti-oppression work forever. Sometimes there can be this, and I think we're at risk for it now during times when so many groups are under attack, that there can be this like further disconnection and a replication of hierarchies when I say this all the time, these systems of oppression are coming for us all. And some of us may have different privileges or more privilege. Yeah, we need to understand that and be discerning. I don't negate that. That's a real thing. And I just, as a strategy, I think it's important to zoom out, to look at these points of connection, resonance, larger patterns, so that we can align. Even if our dharmas are different, we can align to disrupt these things that are in the way of liberation and actually antithetical to yoga, really, if we think about it as a path. I'm glad you named a community that I don't identify as queer, right? So there's a community I'm not part of, and yet there's this similarity in the expression of what happens, what manifests when we experience oppression. So
Yes.
that's why I wanted to name it.
Yes, so true. There's a lot of intersectionality. And I just find the conversation really refreshing because being a white person in wellness spaces, there's not typically a lot of analysis of that power dynamic and how supremacy and colonialism factor into and how whiteness is in fact being centered in the space. And I think as people that maybe are othered in a lot of contexts, we're kind of forced to analyze, those systems of power in a way that a straight, white, cisgender person, maybe just doesn't have to. And so my mind is kind of constantly running on that background in trying to be an ally to people of color. It's like, yeah, just constantly analyzing all of these things, but trying to bring it up to other white people as I feel is my duty.
Mm-hmm.
My God. It's like there's
Mm-hmm.
so much deconditioning that needs to be done before I can even get through. But this is truly what this path is about. And so I just find it to be such an important conversation that really more people need to be having, but
Mm-hmm.
it's uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. I often talk about discomfort and the path of yoga. And while I understand it's a liberatory path in my experience of it and from what I've learned, I don't know if we can get to that place of liberation without working through or acknowledging some of what might feel uncomfortable for people to acknowledge about the context in which we live, even if the path is more expansive, and we are actually, than our identities and this timeline we're in right now. There's more going on. And I also often think about how many times a teacher has in an asana class or a meditation space has invited me into discomfort, like to befriend it, to understand it, to be with it, to witness it, to lean into it. Most people that I know have had that experience. That invitation has been extended to them. And to me, the yoga is not just the physical posture, right? Or the meditation and working with the mind or even working with the breath. All of these are parts of the technology of it and the design of it and the path. But I've mentioned it's a way of living, which means we practice it in a certain context. Maybe it's in the container of an asana. And I always offer this to my classes. And what do we do with that asana, in the container of the world? How do we take that somewhere else? Because yes, I can manipulate my body and feel things in it, and I can become embodied, right? I can come back to the body, particularly in response to how trauma is connected to oppression and moves us out of the body in so many ways. And these systemic patterns of disembodiment, like physical disembodiment that happens. But how do we think about the container of the world and our practice is what I would invite. And what you named about that deconditioning and shedding. I often talk about this, yoga is, in my experience of it, meant to, yes, reveal things to us, but also ask us to shed layers that are not, and samskaras or tendencies that are not aligned with getting free. I mean, ultimately the root causes of our suffering constrain us more. They don't allow, they create obstacles to freedom and releasing what needs to be released and eventually releasing from the body. I mean, that is, we know, and particularly in the Yoga Sutras, that is what is centered. We're learning all these practices so we can get free and not cling so much to the physicality, the body, this life, this timeline, which is not easy. I don't mean to say these things as if they're easy to work with. I think they can be deeply uncomfortable. And yet, isn't this what the path asks us to practice? That's how I see it.
Absolutely. As you were sharing that, I was just reflecting that there's like two dichotomies. I feel like there's yoga clients that are coming for the workout, or I'm sure some of them are interested in the spiritual component as well. But it's like they're seeking that discomfort in their body because they're looking for a workout. And so they want to get strong. So they know you have to have a little bit of suffering to strengthen your muscles. And then when it comes to unpacking the colonialism and classism and all the isms of it all, then there's like, whoa, we can't touch that with a 10-foot pole. It's too uncomfortable emotionally. Meanwhile, what I've observed among queer people is because of that intersectionality, there's so much willingness to dive into the emotional discomfort. Let's talk about therapy. Let's talk about trauma. Let's talk about capitalism and white supremacy, like diving into the emotional discomfort. But then physically, there's a lot of resistance toward discomfort. And part of it is because I do see a lot of clients who experience chronic pain or
Yeah.
yes. And yeah, I just find that really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think part of that is also what you're naming about how people might enter this practice, particularly in a westernized context or version of it. Well, we're human and we're spiritual. You didn't say it that way. And the path is designed to work with our like physicality and humanness and humanity and us as spiritual divine beings. And I think part of the colonization and commodification of this practice is that often people enter it through the physical body and in a capitalist context that tells us to buy things to look better, right? To change our bodies to look better. That wellness is being thin and white and heterosexual and all these things, right? That these are the messages that are shared with us that so many of us who don't fit that internalize. And I think that then lends itself to this training, thinking, conditioning that yoga is a physical workout and that we have no pain, no gain. So that which is different than discomfort to me. I mean, there's this way people can relate to the practice where they are there for the physical manipulation of the body and not open to the reality that they're spiritual and it's actually a spiritual practice. And there can be I need to feel the pain to feel like I've mastered or attained whatever this practice has to offer. And I don't know that enlightenment comes through suffering. I'm not sure. I don't know. I have questions about that. I just have questions. I know learning can come from suffering. And often I reflect on how I think, how much is too much? How much suffering are we going to experience collectively until we shift the way we live? And isn't the path designed to teach us how to do that? And so I think it's complex. And often what I invite people into is, you might be here for a workout, right? Or to master the practice. Now, practice to me is important and the repetition of things and the rigor that we bring and that we show up as humble, reverent students. And I also think the world is really challenging and people have to regulate their nervous systems. And this striving and imbalance of that doesn't necessarily serve us collectively or our freedom. I think about that. And so I'll be like, maybe you're here for a workout and that's what you want from this. And this is a spiritual workout. It is a spiritual workout. It is not, to me, just a physical workout. I can move my body in lots of ways and sweat and feel that, but it is meant to change us and connect us more deeply to our true nature. That's spirit work to me. That might in part happen through the physical body, but there's so much more. So I always invite people into that in different ways, and I teach a weekly class in Winston where I live. And, when new people come, I'm not sure they know what to expect and based on where they may have practiced before or different teachers. And I just offer what I offer anyway. It's I need to teach this as a spiritual path and practice because I'm doing a disservice in teaching something other than yoga when I don't bring the spiritual part of this into the practice. I don't want to be rote and just teach asanas, even though they're powerful and transformative. I want people to feel like their spirit has moved in some way when they leave an experience with me.
The asanas definitely can be potent, and working with the body to regulate the nervous system is I think one reason why this practice can benefit people that have been through trauma and oppressed people so much. And that's a good point that you make about the commodification of the like what we perceive as a workout
Hmm.
portion of the practice. And I also in the book you talk about this at length, how it's a direct result of capitalism and white supremacy, this kind of purity culture that we have built up around our bodies and looking a certain way. And then when you get into like higher levels of privilege, it's like more and more obsession with that. Like, what kind of green juice can I spend 20 bucks on? Like, what kind of Lululemon leggings can I grab? And it really is so backwards, but it makes sense when we think about it within the context of capitalism. But because we don't have that context readily available and most people aren't familiar with the history of yoga, I think the average person doesn't realize that yoga is so much more than the asana postures.
Yeah. And I think we also need to think about the larger context in which people are trained to teach. I mean, I think there's I've been through, I don't countless trainings now, but 200-hour, 300-hour yin yoga, like a bunch of teaching spaces, learning spaces, and have many different teachers now. And I think the landscape has changed. I was trained in 2009 for my 200-hour. So it's been 15 years ago. So I think the landscape has shifted a lot. The industry has shifted as well. I do think there are more marginalized voices centered. Accessibility is certainly centered in a way it was not when I went through yoga teacher training. Like it just wasn't. And I'm thinking back to like the information my teachers had at that time to share with me and the little that I knew about the path other than how I felt when I went to practice and my desire. I was a clinical social worker at the time. So my desire was to bring the practice into my social work practice, to work with the body more because I worked with a lot of people who had experienced trauma. And I wanted to not only talk about the mind body connection, I wanted to invite that in. I wonder sometimes what it would be like for me to go through a 200-hour training now or a 300-hour training now, because I think some things have shifted. But at that time, I think we still have some limitations now, but I think there were some limitations to like what people taught, and particularly in the container of a 200-hour and credentialing for that. I mean, there's a whole other conversation about capitalism and the commodification of a spiritual practice and then getting certified to teach that practice, even though I'm certified, I'm putting quotes, right? To teach. What does that even mean when this is an ancient practice? What does that mean? Like, what does it mean that I call myself a spiritual teacher and a yoga teacher? I am a spiritual teacher. I will claim that. That is true to me. But like, what does it mean that I call myself a yoga teacher? Like, based on what? And so I go there too because I am sort of curious in that way and analytical in that way and like want to understand more about this. I also think being honest and authentic about my connection to the path and how I entered into it and what I've learned makes me an honest space holder and teacher and facilitator of this path and accountable in some ways. Like I want to ask myself these questions so that I can continue to be like, do I call myself a yoga teacher? Is that the right terminology? Or is there something else? Do I call what I teach yoga? Or should I be calling it something else? I just think these are important inquiries for those of us who maybe came to the path similarly to the way that I did, or the practice, who are not like blood lineage. I'm not directly connected to this spiritual path based on what I understand about my ancestry, my DNA, the path of yoga that I learned. And so I think it's important for those of us who draw from this practice so much and gather so much, who are not directly connected through lineage, blood lineage, I would say, to just be in question, to just be curious about what that means, about what we offer.
Definitely. On one hand, this commodification maybe is a net positive because so many people now have access to yoga and it is really worldwide. But on the other hand, yeah, it's a version of yoga that it's pretty far removed from the
Yeah.
original version. And I think that's where the disconnect comes in. And that's where we get into the territory of cultural appropriation rather than appreciation. And so it's a very big responsibility, in my opinion, to be or call myself a yoga teacher. I was laughing while you were sharing because I stayed with a monk at an ashram this past January. He's a monk of the Sri Ananda Morti tradition, and he's been a tantric monk for 20 years or longer. And he was asking me, like, "So you're a yoga teacher?" And I'm like, "That's what I call myself." But
Hmm.
using like the word yogi or yogini, like we just in Western context have casually thrown this word around, a word that it holds so much more like cultural weight and significance than what the average Western yoga practitioner would realize. So really giving credit where credit is due. And like you said, just acknowledging like the context or the way that we come to this knowledge and that it's not from our direct ancestry.
Yeah, that feels important. And I think, I haven't said this in a long time, but for many years, while I acknowledge that my blood ancestry is not blood lineage directly connected to the path of yoga that I am immersed in and have learned and teach from, that my people did have spiritual practices and a code of ethics connected to those, like the yamas and niyamas, these observances. And maybe they weren't called meditation in the way that I've been taught, but that was happening, or connection to the earth and nature and elemental energy, which is very much connected to the chakra system in yoga, for example, right? And the values and flow of energy. So I think while I strive to be accountable, I should say, and acknowledge where I learned this path and also understand the westernization of yoga, I also think I want to make space for where there's overlap. Like in many of our lineages, there were rituals, traditions connected to spiritual practices that in some way intersect with what we might practice when we go practice yoga. Like both to me feel true. And yoga is the spiritual path that has spoken to me, that has moved me in these ways that some spiritual practices directly connected to my ancestry don't move me in the same way. I think we, make room for that. I'm not like going and picking and choosing in an irreverent way what I want to practice spiritually. I think we need to be reverent. I think we need to study. I think we need to build a relationship with this. I think we need to honor the roots of the practices. And I'm somebody who identifies as interspiritual, which means that I draw from many spiritual lineages because of the way they have moved me and changed me, and they relate to the vision of liberation I have for the world and the importance of ritual. So I just want to offer that to folks listening to, like, it's layered. We've used that word. And to be quite frank, I have limited information about some of my ancestral practices. People traced back to my great grandmother and prior were enslaved and separated from practice through a process of colonization and stealing people. And I think that's important context too for people to understand. And perhaps I think that's one of the reasons why, right, I'm interspiritual and there's resonance with these other practices that may relate back to my lineage, but I don't have all the information I need to understand what those practices are, because that's part of what is severed when we engage in this oppression and colonization, and also take things like take a practice from its source, which is connected to land, which is connected to like geography and people and custom and tradition. I'm somebody who's not a necessarily binary thinker because life feels way more complex to me than that, than either or. So I just offer that in the spirit of like a mind that understands things are not linear or binary most of the time. And how do we make space for it all and be curious about it?
Absolutely. I think that's something that comes up a lot during cultural appropriation conversations. It's kind of the root of the appropriation is being cut off from our own ancestry, or maybe not necessarily resonating or not having access to. It is important to also acknowledge many people of color, and especially people of African ancestry, do not have access to information about their ancestry because of slavery and racism, white supremacy. And it is something that it's a privilege for white people to at least have that information, for more of us to have that information. But at the same time, because of whiteness and like whitewashing of global culture, even white people are cut off from many indigenous traditions that their ancestors may have had, leaving a void that we then want to fill by cherry picking what we think is cool from other cultures. And therein lies the problem, because that's not reverent and it's deeply harmful, even if it has like the best of intentions.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of that cherry picking. I'm going to try this. I'm going to try this on. And some of that's, people are experimenting with like what aligns and what doesn't. But who has the privilege to do that? I mean, that's really what I heard and what you shared about that. And we can just think about dominant culture, like who is saying what is valuable. If we think about a hierarchy of bodies based on race and other identities, right? Who gets to decide? Well, this is the practice we practice, right? Or we're going to take this today and see how it feels. And then I'm going to teach it and offer it and charge a lot of money for it. And, it's like, I'm not sure that's what we need to be doing. I'm clear it's not. And so just the intersection of privilege in this and at times, I think lack of consciousness about this pattern of extraction. I think sometimes people are well aware of what they're doing, but I think the void that you named sometimes leaves people to engage in ways that they're not conscious of and aren't clear about the impact of taking indigenous practices, claiming them as their own, and then adding like capitalism, selling those back
Hmm.
to indigenous folks. Yeah.
Yes, the consumerism of it all, the your culture is my costume of it all. That's where it gets to be just really icky. It makes me think back to earlier this year. I was hosting a retreat in Guatemala and we were doing a cacao ceremony, which is very popular here in Cleveland, a Mayan cacao ceremony, no less. And the Mayan shaman, those two women that were facilitating for us, it was a wonderful experience. She was telling me about how cacao ceremony is not a thing in Mayan culture. That's literally a thing that white people were like, oh, you guys have cacao. We like chocolate too. And we like your culture. Now there's like cacao facilitator trainings and certifications that you can buy that are facilitated by white people. And it's an indigenous practice that, at least in that Mayan community, she said that's not a thing. We don't have cacao ceremonies. So that's just, I thought that was a really good example of this commodification and then selling back to the people whose culture the thing originally came from. And yeah, that's just capitalism, baby.
That is a really good example. I'm glad you like made it specific. I think that's a really good example. And people can go find a cacao ceremony any day of the week. That's interesting and not surprising to me, but interesting.
So I think this is a really good segue into a reflection prompt that you wanted to share with us. And then maybe we can talk about the journaling prompt and then go into the practice.
Sure. In Skill and Action, both the first edition and second edition, and every book I've ever written, there are a lot of journaling questions. I acknowledge George Ella Lyons and other people who this poem originally came from. Lots of educators use it. It's this practice where people think about where they're from. I'm just thinking about roots and what we talked about in ancestry and the different layers to that, right? To answer this question of where we're from. I think the invitation for people would be to contemplate the depth of that question, like where you're from, the geography, the traditions, the customs, the narratives and stories, landscapes that you're from. If there's a faith-based component to that, even if it's not something you identify with now, right? The different emotions you come from, right? Your origin story and how you might answer that. So the prompt is where are you from, but the invitation is to really deepen into that question in all the ways and to see what arises. Again, not as like a definitive, like this is who you are now, but as an exploration to notice like the missing parts of that. Like what information don't I have? What have I internalized? What has shaped me? Where there's pride, where there might be other emotions connected to our origin stories. This is based on the conversation we've had, but the reason I just wanted to invite it in, we carry ourselves with us wherever we go. And I think it's important to understand our shaping and how that does influence how we move through the world and how we interact with others, how we view things, our worldview, our perspective. I also found in facilitating this Where I'm From activity that people have, through writing and embodiment, some sort of space, sovereign, to know some of the things we talked about in exploring this question and an invitation to relate to where they're from, maybe differently. What does it mean? I grew up in Virginia and went to Jamestown, and every school trip was there. Like, talk about colonization. And I have so many memories of going there, right? And went to college at William and Mary and walked on the cobblestone streets where like slaves were sold, but indigenous people lived there before and the Virginia House of Burgesses is right on campus, right? And so it's like, how's that shaped me, right? How has that growing up when that's in the air, permeates the air? I can visualize the things that happen there. How does that shape how I move through the world and see the world, that history in me, even as I identify as a Southerner with pride? But like, what does it mean? So that's just an example. So the question I would invite people to be with is, where are you from?
Yeah, just to share, I loved doing that practice, the Where I'm From. In the book, it's formatted as a poem. It helped me just to get a little deeper into, yeah, what are the cultural inputs that shaped me and my lineage? Because I think that sometimes there can be like, who am I to feel X, Y, and Z emotions because, I have this privilege. It just really brought more insight, just reflecting on those simple things. Yes, please. Let's go into a short practice.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for sharing that about your experience with the Where I'm From exercise. So I'll guide a practice. It's called Justice in the Body, Justice in the World. If you read Skill in Action, this edition, there's some other practices that lead up to this. For this, I'll just guide the prompts and invite us to begin to visualize and somatically feel into alignment and justice in the body, and then a vision for that in the world. And so I invite folks, if you're in a place where you can find a way to be in your body, you're not driving, right? Don't close your eyes if you're driving. But like, if you're in a place where you can just find a seat or a different way, you don't have to be still. I invite you to find a way to be in your body. If you wish to close your eyes, you can close your eyes, or you can soften your gaze, or you can keep your eyes open, up to you. And we'll take a moment to connect with the breath in the body. So I invite you to take a deep breath in and deep breath out. And as you bring your awareness to the breath, just begin to notice the texture and shape, the quality of the breath, the sound and feel of it as you breathe in and breathe out. And begin to deepen and lengthen your breath in your body. We talked about the breath. So feeling the expansion as you inhale and that depth and centeredness coming back to center as you exhale. Maybe deepen your breath a bit more. And as you do, think about and feel into this link between the breath and life, and how the breath is life-giving, and how one breath moves into the body, empties, and then gives rise to another breath or cycle, the inhale and exhale. And as you connect with the breath and life in this way, I invite you to notice how you feel in your body with each exhale, deepening, and every inhale, that inspiration in the body and the subtle alignment that happens through breath and a connection to the breath. And if you found access to a deeper breath here, it's being in this contemplation of the themes that have emerged during this conversation of justice, of a spiritual path and yoga, of everyone having space to breathe, and your own access to a deeper breath in the here and now. And so, what might this experience of the breath now in the body as it deepens, what might this experience be like in the world if everyone had space to breathe? In this way, creating justice within yourself and alignment with breath and freedom of movement through the freedom of prana to move through you, your life force. And then how we create this in the world by making space for everyone to breathe and be. I invite you to take a few more deep breaths here. Invitation to return to this experience when you need, and to bring the sensation of breath and life into the world as an act of justice, the creation of a just world. And whenever you feel ready, you can gently bring yourself back. You could stay here for longer if you wish, and you could note any impressions or visions or just anything about that experience. What do you understand about how justice feels in the body, what it feels like in the body, that alignment, that connection, access to life force? And what is your vision of this for the world? That is the prompt I will offer. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. So I know that you have a really awesome online course. I would love to hear more about that and anywhere else that folks can connect with you.
Yeah, thanks. The easiest way to connect with me is through my website, michellecjohnson.com. When people visit the website, there's an invitation to receive my weekly newsletter. I send out a newsletter every Thursday morning, and it ranges in topic. There's an offering of some practices in those newsletters and my upcoming events. So if you want to learn more about me and my life and what I'm moving through and the larger themes that we move through as a collective, the newsletter is a great way, plus upcoming events, which are also listed on my website. And then I'm on social media. Skill in Action is my handle on Instagram. I post pretty regularly there. And I have an on-demand course based on Skill in Action. You can find it on my website. There's a Skill in Action website. You can find the course there too. It's about 7.5 to 8 hours of content. It's self-paced. It includes some sharing like we did today. Lecture, I'll say loosely. I use that word loosely, but because I don't consider myself a lecturer. And it includes some practices, some journaling prompts, reflections along the way. And it's really meant to invite people to embody the principles of skill and action and to bring that into their lives, whether or not they're a yoga practitioner or teacher. I mean, it's really for anybody who wants to learn more about this path, but also certainly for people who hold space and teach this path and people curious about how to radicalize their practice. It's all of that. And it's offered at a sliding scale, 3-tiered. There's also a pay what you can option. So I'd love for people, if you want to learn more and learn from me in that way, and move at your own pace, that's a great opportunity to do it through the Skill and Action On Demand course. There are lots of other ways to practice and study with me, various topics I've written books about. My website's updated pretty frequently, so I'd love to meet folks from this community, either online or in person at some point.
Amazing. Are you doing any yoga teacher trainings right now?
I am not. People tend to ask that. I've offered them for years and years. And I was in school for spiritual direction for 16 months. And now I'm in a doctorate of ministry program. Ministry is like what you do in the world, just so people know that in this context. I sort of paused because school was happening in those ways and created the on-demand course. It's not a training in that way, but it is a deep dive. I've offered like 200 hours, 300-hour trainings, and this 75-hour continuing ed. Just stay tuned. You never really know with me. I'm always sort of in the creative process. So lots of things coming out. But there's a way, if people are interested in knowing if I offer a training and when that is, they can, through my website, they can sign up for an interest list for that.
Okay, perfect. Amazing. I'll link your website and everything else in the show notes. Thank you so much for being here, Michelle.
Thank you. Lovely to be in community with you in conversation. And thanks for doing this work and practice in this way.
To summarize, in this episode, we unpacked how the power structures of white supremacy and capitalism have contributed to such a lack of diversity among yoga practitioners, despite yoga's Indian origins. Then we shared a fascinating conversation with author Michelle Cassandra Johnson about how to radicalize your yoga practice for social justice and racial equity. And I'll include links to Michelle's website and the Skill in Action website in the show notes. Imagine how magical it would be to do your morning yoga and meditation practice out in the open air on a sun-kissed rooftop terrace while monkeys skitter along the power lines above and cows bellow on the streets below. Here's an opportunity to immerse yourself in a soul-stirring spiritual journey through Mother India next January. From the sacred ghats of the holy city Varanasi to the tranquil serenity of Rishikesh, this vibrant yoga retreat offers a pilgrimage to the roots of yoga. Explore ancient temples, offer service at Sri Ram Ashram, and witness Vedic rituals along the Ganges River. This is not only a yoga retreat, it's a spiritual initiation. Travel has been a potent spiritual experience for me, you guys, and it is my great honor to guide others through their own spiritual travel experiences. Do you feel called to join us? Please apply on our website at yourloved.one/India-yoga-retreat. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, let's stay connected and stay witchy. I'll talk to you soon, and blessed be. With all my love, Lee Davy.